All right, so this is going to be the second part in the notes on Jacksonian America, the presidency of Andrew Jackson. Today we're going to emphasize the third of the four major events of Jackson's presidency, which is going to be the Trail of Tears. Before we get into that, we'll recap really quick. We talked about yesterday, or the last video, the um, uh, Petticoat War, in which Jackson responded to the treatment of Peggy Eaton um, by driving a wedge between him and much of his cabinet because the way she was treated was so reminiscent of Jackson's wife before she died. And then the nullification crisis, which is a real example of Jackson really expanding and using the powers of the presidency and increasing them to levels that we hadn't really seen from any prior presidents. So one of the trends of Andrew Jackson's presidency, again, to kind of reiterate, is you really see him expand the power of the president to fit his own needs and his own wants, but he largely expands his power to get the things that he wants. So there's always that argument: is Andrew Jackson as president and being from the South a states' rights guy, or is he really a national power guy? And there's really no easy answer to that because he certainly advocated for certain aspects of states' rights, but at the same time, he thought the presidency the power of the presidency in many ways was more absolute than the previous presidents thought, who wanted to avoid authoritarian or monarchical type rule. So we're going to see again today examples of Jackson using that power and expanding the power of the presidency when we're dealing with the Trail of Tears and what happens with Native Americans. So again, quiz on Tuesday, packet on Tuesday. All right, so we'll get right to it then. So the big talk here is going to be about removal of the Indians, and this is basically what the Trail of Tears is. So you could either call it removal of Indians or the Trail of Tears. All right. So to begin, you gotta kind of let's take a look, because ultimately what this slide is about is our chapter by chapter definition of how did white man screw the natives in this particular case. And this is one of the biggest screw jobs we've ever put on Native Americans, and there are many. So let's talk a little bit about how the emerging white attitudes continue to change and grow about natives. Um, and you got to understand there is a lot of hostility between Native Americans and whites. Now, when we talked about the Revolutionary War, remember, and the war, the French and Indian War, and even the War of 1812, the natives always side with the British. They basically always side with um, whoever is against the Americans, white Americans. Uh, and now that we're in the 1830s, this takes place roughly about 1832. That was bad. But this takes place roughly about 1832, what we're talking about here. And white attitudes toward the tribes have not changed. Okay, there's, if anything, is more hostility towards Native Americans. And probably part of this is a result of the rhetoric that Andrew Jackson had as president. By 1832, he's been president for a few years, and it's no secret that Andrew Jackson hates Indians, hates Native Americans. So, as we often see, the country follows suit with its political leader, with the president. And if Andrew Jackson doesn't like natives, the common man likes Andrew Jackson. Therefore, the common man doesn't like Native Americans either. So these white attitudes towards the tribes are souring a little bit, even more than they already were. Okay, we're seeing conflicts kind of rise up as settlers continue to push further west, bringing them into conflict with Native Americans, many of which, the natives, had already been displaced from other regions as whites had moved in there. So you see just building up towards inevitable conflict between the two sides because of the the relationship problems that exist between both. And that's going to be obviously an issue as well. And it all culminates in something called the Black Hawk War, which should have been there. I don't know why it wasn't. There we go. All right, so first we'll talk about the Black Hawk War right here. So we'll talk about the 5 civilized tribes later. I'm sorry that screwed up. So basically, the Black Hawk War was a small conflict between the United States and members of a couple native tribes that were in the region of like Iowa, Wisconsin, who had prior been into the region of Illinois, but were kind of forced out of Illinois as whites pushed further west. These two tribes are the Sauk, pronounced Sauk, and the Fox tribes. The Fox tribe has a more complicated name, so we'll just call them the Foxes. So basically, the Fox and the Sox were led by Black Hawk, who was their tribal leader, and he and a group of natives moved further east to kind of try to reclaim some tribal land in Illinois. Okay, they were met with hostility and opposition by U.S. militia that tried to respond by pushing them out. Okay, it is worthy of note that we also see in the Black Hawk War the emergence of yet another new generation of military leaders, particularly Winfield Scott and Zachary Taylor, who would be major players in the Mexican War that takes place in the 1840s. Other guys that fought in the Black Hawk War included Jefferson Davis, a young Jefferson Davis who would become president of the Confederacy during the Civil War, and a young Abraham Lincoln, who of course becomes president later himself. Anyway, the typical back and forth happens. It was actually a particularly brutal conflict in terms of how viciously the U.S. militia and military pursued these natives and kind of pushed them back into tribal lands in Iowa, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, what places later became those states. It was kind of a dogged pursuit of these native people to push them away and get them out of here. And as usually is the case, it results in a loss for the natives and a win for the whites. Black Hawk ultimately is captured and was put in jail for a year. And this kind of adds fuel to Jackson's fire about how Native Americans are bad and why we should try to buy land from them to push them further and further away. So a little bit more here on the Black Hawk War. We also see the continuation of the trend that's going to continue until all the Native Americans are captured and sent to reservations, where we write treaties with natives regarding land. So we write treaties with natives regarding land and ultimately break those treaties. It's kind of a sad trend and is another example of how horrible really white Americans treated Native American people. You can always make an argument. I think there is an argument to be made that as horrible as slavery was, we've done some horrible things. White Americans have done some horrible things, and as bad as slavery was, you could make an argument that what was done to Native Americans is worse. Now, what is the importance of Black Hawk's War? What it does, like I said before, it adds fuel to the fire of getting these Native American tribes out of lands claimed by the United States. Push them further west, get them out of their tribal lands, and move on. And this is a complicated process because, again, when we're talking about treaties, you're talking about treaties made with tribes that say you're allowed to have this land. But then, as whites move further west, they say, we change our mind about the treaty. We want to buy this land from you and push you further west. Okay? And that may not sound like a big deal. Okay, buy the land and move on. But imagine that, somebody comes to your house and says, I really like your house, and here's, and just offers you a sum of money to buy your house and say, okay, so and then you have to go move to this other house that the person that bought your house has picked for you. Okay, most people probably don't want to do that, no matter what the amount of money is, right? If you're going to move, you want to pick your own house. And basically, these natives are being removed from their home and forced to go somewhere else. Yeah, the land is being sold theoretically, but it's not their home. It's not their house. And that is why Indian removal and the Trail of Tears here were such a bad thing. Okay? Now, talking about the 5 civilized tribes. In the South, like Georgia, Alabama, around there were what was regarded as the 5 civilized tribes. And they were the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Creek, and the Seminole. And these were considered the 5 civilized tribes. They had taken on some small aspects of white society a little bit. They traded openly with, white settlers and traders, and there was a relatively good relationship. Okay, so they referred to them as the 5 civilized tribes. Well, we know Andrew Jackson hates Native Americans. Dating back to his youth, he'll do anything to get rid of natives. Okay, and this is what ultimately results in the Trail of Tears. And essentially what happens is Jackson uses the power of the government, another example of Andrew Jackson expanding the power of the executive, expanding the power of the presidency to force Native Americans to leave their tribal lands, leave their homes, and move further west. This goes back to the example I gave you before, right? Somebody comes to your house and says, we're going to take your house from you. We're going to pay you some money for it. We're going to take your house from you, and we're going to move you to this house. It's not your house. It may even be a bigger house, but it's not your house. It might not be what you want. To remove Native American people from their lands, which are very sacred and very important to them, is really, really a harsh thing to do, and really represents one of the one of the real low points in our country's history. Soldiers that kind of forced the evacuation of these native tribes, particularly the Cherokee, from their native lands, wrote, journals and stories about it as to how devastating it was. They basically had to walk from their tribal lands in Georgia and Alabama far west to like Oklahoma, areas like what becomes Oklahoma. And there's not a lot of great land in Oklahoma. It's much more arid, and it's very different than the land that they're familiar with. Many of them die on this trek. Many of the natives die on this trek, and that's why it becomes known as the Trail of Tears, because it was just this sad, sad series of events that really define another example of how the Native Americans were treated so poorly in our country's history, and guided largely because of Andrew Jackson's disdain and distaste for natives. So, kind of questions for today are what is the meaning of removal? What does it mean, in other words, to Native people to be removed from their home? So just shoot me an email with the answers to these questions. What does it mean to be taken from your home and put somewhere else? And why is this so harsh and so bad for the native people of these regions? And also, what would have been a couple alternatives instead of forcing the removal of natives from their home? What are other things we could have done while still being able to settle further west and more land? So that's what I want you to think about for today. So what is the connection between all this here? The Black Hawk War increases sentiments and the white attitudes towards the tribes that they're bad and they have to go, also helped by Andrew Jackson's hatred for natives. And because of the Black Hawk War, the resultant effect of the Black Hawk War is Indian removal, is the Trail of Tears. So we see again another series of events lead to yet another negative event that is very influential in the history of our country. So there we go. Here's a picture of Black Hawk and the native leader. You see, kind of a little bit of, kind of the more tribal dress and appearance here versus a little bit of a more assimilated appearance where you see a native leader taking on more, Black Hawk taking on more of a white man's type clothing. So there is a little bit of that cultural assimilation going on too. So in that same vein, we'll close out today talking about another major Supreme Court decision, one of the last major decisions of the Federalist Marshall Court. And this is the case of Worcester v. Georgia in 1832. The question, the issue in question is, can the states have anything to do with Indian affairs? This is a dicey question because the Native Americans are not technically citizens or have any rights as Americans. They're essentially another country of people living on our lands. It's almost as if you have somebody living at your house, again, that doesn't, use anything in the house and doesn't want anything to do with the house, doesn't pay any of the bills, but doesn't necessarily cause too many problems either. But you're like, do we really want them around? Okay. So ultimately, the question is, can the states have anything to do with Indian affairs? Okay. Is it a state issue to deal with sending Native Americans elsewhere or trying to come up with treaties? The answer, of course, in a John Marshall court is going to be no. Only the federal government has the power to deal with Indians. So even if the Indians are in a particular state, so only the federal government can tell Indians where to go and deal with what is going on with them. So if there's a bunch of natives in Ohio, and Ohio has a government, and Ohio is well established, and Ohio says, well, we want to come to an agreement and a treaty with Native Americans to give them a little area of the state where they can live. Ohio can't do that. Only the federal government can claim supremacy over natives, okay? And again, this is another example of something that strengthens the power of the federal government at the expense of the states. It's, again, the federal government dictating to the states, you can't handle this particular situation. It's our responsibility. So that, again, expands that power at the federal level, limits the power at the state level, and forces any decisions regarding Native Americans to be handled by the federal government, determining their future, determining where they can go and where they can't go, and that's ultimately, the story there. So that's all we have for today. Just kind of the one topic. Tomorrow we'll talk about the last major topic of Jackson's presidency, the bank war, and I'll probably have that for you on like Monday or something like that, because remember, the quiz will be on Tuesday because there's no school on Thursday or Friday. So maybe I'll have the video for you tomorrow, if not sometime in between now and Monday. So that's all I've got. Please let me know if you have any questions, and shoot me an email response to those two questions on the couple slides ago as well. All right, see you later.